Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon to talk about entry-level driver training, what fleets and drivers need to know. I'm excited to be joined by Brandon Wiseman, who is the co-founder and president of Trucksafe Consulting and also a partner at Childress Law. And he is going to go through some of the regs with us. And Brandon, if you want to just go to the next slide. He's going to give us a little overview of what Trucksafe is, and then we'll go through the agenda, and then we'll jump right in as we've got a lot to cover.
Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. Appreciate it. Thanks for the invite and welcome, everyone. So, as Marilyn said, I'm the president of Trucksafe Consulting and an attorney with Childress Law. So, I've been practicing law for about 11 years now. Previously worked at a pretty large law firm, primarily in the area of DOT safety and compliance. So working with larger trucking companies on their safety programs, helping them build out their policies and their procedures, and helping them with their CSA scores and their safety ratings and that type of stuff. So did that for many years, and then earlier last year broke off on my own, started Trucksafe. And wanted to create kind of a solution for smaller to mid-sized carriers that don't have the same resources as the larger carriers, where they could still have access to the educational content that they need, the training that they need to help them understand their obligations under the safety regulations, and to help them comply with those regulations and keep out of the crosshairs, not only of the DOT, but also of the plaintiff's bar. So we offer a lot of training resources through Trucksafe, online courses, and then one-on-one consulting as well. And then through our law firm, Childress Law, we do legal consulting on these types of DOT issues as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, that's great. We certainly thank you for being an expert on these regulations and providing us with your resources. And so what we're going to talk about today is Brandon's going to go through what is the ELDT mandate, how did we get here, who does this apply to, right? What does it mean, who is eligible, and then at the end we're going to talk about how Tenstreet can help you and possibly how Trucksafe can help you, and then we're going to leave a little bit of time for questions and answers. And so if you have questions, please just put them in the questions box or the chat box, and we will answer those either live or in the chat box itself. And then if you have to leave early, or you will get a copy of this recording in your inbox within 24 hours. So no worries if you miss something, we will get a copy of it to you. And so I'm going to go quiet now and let you do your thing, Brandon.
Awesome. Thanks, Marilyn. All right, so we're going to kick things off here with a mistake on the slide. So this is my fault. So disregard the word upcoming here in this slide. So this rule, the entry-level driver training rule that we're going to be talking about, is in effect. So it's no longer upcoming, it is in effect. So as Marilyn said, we're going to break down what exactly is the entry-level driver training rule, where it comes from, who is subject to it, who can provide the training, and then address some of the frequently asked questions that we're hearing a lot about. So how did we get here? Why are we even talking about entry-level driver training? Marilyn and I were joking before we started here, saying that we feel like we've been talking about entry-level driver training for about 15 years or so, and it has been a while. So the U.S. Congress told the FMCSA back in its MAP 21 legislation back in 2016 that it needed to do something about training, additional training requirements for CDL drivers, so drivers of larger trucks and buses. Congress saw fit for the agency to institute more stringent standards around the process because, as many of you probably know now, the process to date has not been all that structured. I mean, how you learn how to drive these larger vehicles, you kind of train to the test, right? So you know that you got to pass a test at the DMV to get the license. So you kind of study up on the test. You may learn from your brother or your dad how to actually operate the truck. And as long as you can pass those tests, then you're good to go. Well, Congress wanted to put some more parameters around that based on some of the studies that they were looking at, and so they directed the FMCSA to promulgate additional regulations around this process of training drivers who are getting their CDLs and certain endorsements, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And so that's how we got here. The Congress told FMCSA to do this. FMCSA is now getting around to doing it. This rule was originally set to take effect in 2020. It got pushed back to February 7th of this year because of some IT issues. As we'll talk about, there's an integration between the FMCSA's online system for the training provider registry, which we'll talk about, and then state licensing agencies that have to access that registry and check to make sure the records are uploaded. So there has to be this interaction between the federal system and the state systems. And from what I understand, it was just a bear to get put in place. So anyway, it got delayed until February 7th of 2022, but lo and behold, here we are today. It is now in effect as of February 7th, 2022. So what exactly is the rule doing? Well, as you can see here on the slide, the rule is essentially displacing the existing entry-level driver training rules that existed up to that date. And if you're saying what existing entry-level driver training rules, you're not alone. I've visited several carriers and audited their files over the years, and I've found that many didn't realize that there were existing entry-level driver training rules on the books, and that they actually imposed obligations on motor carriers who employed CDL drivers who had less than 1 year driving experience. So if you went by for all those years without complying with that rule, then the good news is it's no longer in effect. But here's what that prior rule said. It essentially said that if you're a motor carrier that employed CDL drivers who had less than 1 year's driving experience when they came to you, then you as the motor carrier had an obligation to provide them training in 4 areas, essentially driver qualification, hours of service, driver wellness, and whistleblower protections. And then you had to document that training and put it in their driver file, et cetera. So the burden was on you as the motor carrier to provide that training to those CDL drivers. Well, now under the new rule, that old regime goes away. You as the motor carrier no longer have any obligations to provide entry-level driver training to new drivers that come to you. The onus is now on the drivers themselves. If they are seeking to get a CDL, they have to obtain this training from a registered training provider before they can even be eligible to take the skills test that's necessary to get their CDL in the first instance. So let me start off the presentation by saying that if you're a motor carrier and you're joining us and you're here because you want to know what is this rule going to require of me, the good news is the rule is not going to require anything of you unless you want to be a training provider. In fact, the rule does away with some obligations that you may have had in the past. So that's the big takeaway here, is that motor carriers no longer have an obligation to provide entry-level driver training to their drivers. That burden is now on the drivers themselves. So as you can see here, February 7th, as I mentioned, was the date. Effective that date, the drivers who are seeking to obtain certain CDLs, which we'll talk about on the next slide, will have to get this entry-level driver training from a registered training provider before they can then go to their state DMV and take the tests that are necessary to get or to upgrade their CDL. All right, so let's talk about who exactly the rule applies to. So I've got them listed here, essentially 3 categories of drivers, all of which are CDL drivers. So if all you employ are non-CDL drivers, then you don't have to worry about this rule. The rule only affects CDL drivers. So the first group of CDL drivers that it impacts are first-time Class A or Class B CDL applicants. So those who are after February 7th of this year, looking to obtain a Class A or a Class B CDL for the first time. And then the second class or second category of drivers who this impacts are those who have an existing Class B CDL, but after February 7th of this year are looking to upgrade that Class B to a Class A to operate larger combination vehicles, for example. And then lastly, the rule impacts those CDL holders who are seeking to add certain endorsements, namely the school bus, the passenger, or the hazmat endorsement to their existing license, to their existing CDL after February 7th of 2022. So those three categories: Class A or Class B applicants, Class B to Class A upgrades, and those seeking the S, P, or H endorsements. That's the category of drivers who have to obtain this new training to then be eligible to take the skills test. So, and I know we're going to answer questions at the end, but let me head off a few of them here. So, what big question we get is kind of like grandfathering. What about drivers who had their Class A or Class B CDL prior to February 7th? No, they don't have to get this new training. And that's true even if they've previously held a Class A or Class B CDL and then they let it lapse. So let's say I held a Class A CDL back in 2018. I let it lapse and haven't used it, and now I want to go and get it reinstated. Do I have to take this new entry-level driver training? The FMCSA's guidance on that topic says no. If you've held the Class A CDL in the past, you don't have to go through this new training to get the new to get your CDL reinstated. Now, whether the state licensing branches appreciate that guidance, I don't know. So I've heard mixed reviews from drivers who go to their licensing branch and try and complete these transactions with the advice that they're given by the representatives there. So, but that's the FMCSA's guidance on the topic. Same thing. What about drivers who held their commercial learner's permit prior to February 7th of 2022? Do they have to get the training in order to complete the process to then get their CDL? The answer is no. If they had their commercial learner's permit, their CLP, prior to February 7th of this year, and they haven't had to renew that after February 7th, then they are exempt from this new training requirement and they can just complete their CDL transaction without getting the new training. If they got the CLP prior to February 7th and they have to renew it for some reason or another after February 7th, then they would have to get the new training in order to complete that transaction. All right. All right, so what's the process look like then from start to finish? Well, here it is laid out. This is from the FMCSA's website. So here's how it works, generally speaking. So drivers who are in those three categories that I mentioned, they will have to search out on their own a training provider who is listed on the FMCSA's training provider registry. We're going to get into detail here in a little bit about what it takes to be listed on the registry and what requirements training providers have to meet. But suffice it to say, drivers who are looking to complete those CDL transactions that I mentioned have to search out a training provider that's listed on the training provider registry. It's just a simple online search. Another way that it happens too as well is a lot of motor carriers may be offering this training for their existing drivers. So if you're a larger motor carrier and you've got both non-CDL and CDL drivers and you want to be able to offer it as a service to your drivers so they don't have to go elsewhere to find training, maybe you want to offer that training to your drivers, then you can offer that training and you could be registered on the training provider registry. You would just be considered a private training provider offering that training just to your existing employees. So in those situations, obviously the drivers wouldn't have to seek out a training provider. They would be using you, but you would still be listed on the training provider registry. So that's the first step, is finding a registered training provider. And then once you find one, then you go take the training. Now, as we'll talk about in a minute, the training is split up into a couple of different sections, but once you finish the training to the satisfaction of the training provider, that training provider will then submit a completion certificate up to the training provider registry saying that John Doe successfully completed the training, and that will get uploaded within 2 days of John Doe's completion of the training. And then the idea there, the last step, is that the state driver's licensing agencies will then have access to the training provider registry. So when John Doe shows up at the Indiana DMV and says, I'm ready to get my license, the Indiana DMV will check the training provider registry to make sure that there's a certificate from a registered training provider in there for John Doe. And if so, then the state will allow John Doe to schedule the skills test and take it and complete that CDL transaction. So that's the process. Driver finds a training provider, takes the training provider uploads the certificate to the training provider registry. John Doe goes and seeks to complete the CDL transaction, and the state verifies that there's a certificate of completion in the training provider registry, and then the transaction is completed. All right, so what exactly does the training entail? Well, as I mentioned, it's split up in a couple of different components, but the components that a particular driver has to take depends on which of the CDL transactions that they're looking to complete. For example, here we see listed a theory component and a behind the wheel component. Generally speaking, that's what the training is going to encompass. There's going to be a theory component to it, and there's going to be a behind the wheel component to it. The one caveat to that is for drivers who are only seeking a hazmat endorsement. For those of you familiar with the hazmat endorsement, you know that it's in order to get a hazmat endorsement, you only have to take a knowledge test to get that. You don't have to take a skills test. And so because of that fact, drivers who already hold a CDL and who are only looking to add a hazmat endorsement to their CDL, they only have to take a theory component of this entry-level driver training before they can then go to their DMV. Whereas all of the other categories of drivers that I mentioned, first-time Class A and Class B applicants, Class B to Class A upgrade applicants, and then passenger and school bus endorsement applicants, they all would have to take both a theory component and a behind-the-wheel component of the training in order to then be eligible to take those tests to get their CDL and to complete their CDL transactions. So let's break these down. Let's talk first about the theory component. This is essentially a classroom component. It's, this probably looks familiar to you. Anybody who's gotten their standard driver's license will be familiar with this kind of structure where you do some classroom work to make sure you understand the theory of operating a vehicle, and then you go out and practice actually doing it so that you get some experience doing it. That's kind of how this is structured, but obviously for commercial drivers here in much larger vehicles. So the theory component is a classroom component, but with the caveat that it doesn't actually have to be in a physical classroom. The theory component can be provided and taken online. There are a number of online theory component providers. If you search on the FMCSA's training provider registry, you can filter it by online and physical locations. So keep that in mind. Theory component can be conducted online. Now, what exactly are we teaching in the theory component? Well, the FMCSA's rule that established this entry-level driver training requirement has a pretty detailed outline of the topics that have to be addressed in the theory component of the training. There's a whole appendix dedicated to this that outlines all of the various topics that have to be addressed. Things that you would expect, including safe operation of the vehicle, how to actually operate the vehicle, hours of service requirements, licensing requirements, those types of things. Those all have to be included within the curriculum that the driver goes through the theory component. Now, I will say that there is no minimum hours requirement. This is a big question we get a lot. Is there some kind of minimum hours of the theory and or the behind the wheel components that drivers have to take in order to successfully complete it? This was an idea that was toyed with in the rulemaking process, where the agency was looking at, does it make sense to say that we need to have so many hours of theory instruction before the driver can move on, et cetera? Well, they landed on the answer of no. They didn't impose any minimum hours requirement for either the theory or the behind the wheel component. So at the federal level, under the federal rules, there is no minimum hour requirement for either of these. Now, with that said, the theory component, there's going to have to be an assessment, a test issued to the driver once he or she completes it. And the rule does say that the driver has to pass that test with a score of at least 80%. So that's really the only restriction in terms of the curriculum, and then the test is the big component of the theory component of the training. Now, the behind the wheel component, again, no minimum hours requirement at the federal level, but it has to involve basic controls and maneuvers as you would expect. And then the rule says that the training has to be completed to the training provider's satisfaction. So whatever that means to each individual training provider. So you know, they'll have instructors with the drivers riding along, checking them on their basic controls and maneuvers. And then if the driver completes that behind the wheel component to the satisfaction of that training provider, well, then the training provider will upload the certificate. Now, I want to hit on this no minimum hours requirement again because it's important, because there's going to be a lot of confusion, I fear, on this point, because what the rules say is that under the federal rules, there's no minimum hours requirement, but training providers have to meet any state standards that are in place in their particular state. So in other words, the federal rule does not preempt any more stringent state requirements that particular states may have, which is a problem in my view, because you may have one state that says we do have a minimum hours requirement for CDL training, and it's this, but then another state may not have any. So it's going to be kind of a patchwork of laws that your drivers are going to have to be on the lookout for, depending on where they happen to be licensed. Because in order to be eligible to take their skills test to then complete their CDL transaction, not only are they going to have to get this training, but the training is going to have to satisfy any requirements that the state happens to have. So if you're domiciled in a particular state that says we require a minimum of 25 hours of theory component training, and you happen to get your training online from a registered training provider through the FMCSA system who doesn't have a minimum hours requirement, then when you go to get your license in your state that has that minimum hours requirement, I'm worried that the state is going to say to you, nope, that training provider's training is not sufficient to meet our state standards. Now, there is a little comfort we can take here, because in issuing its guidance on this topic, the FMCSA said that online training providers only are not subject to state minimum requirements, but in-person training providers are subject to state requirements. And that kind of makes intuitive sense, because if you're an online training provider, you know, otherwise you would have to be kind of doing like a 50 state survey to see what each state requires. And then you would have to make sure that your training covers the most stringent of all of those states, so that anybody that takes your course could theoretically go get their CDL. So that's the case for online training providers. But for in-person training providers, they have to meet any state standards that apply in their state. So if you are one of those training providers, you need to be checking with your state to see what they require. And if you're a driver that is seeking out entry-level driver training from a provider, you need to do some due diligence on your end to make sure, number one, what are my state's requirements, if any? Are there any minimum hours? That's the big one you're going to watch out for. And if so, is the training provider that I'm thinking about going to, do they meet those minimum requirements? All right, so we've talked about who must get the training. Let's talk about who can provide the training. So the rules, as you would expect, set some minimum requirements for those who are providing the training. Now, the first thing I'll say is that this is a self-certification process. So it's not like the DOT is coming in and verifying that training providers meet these requirements. They are requiring these training providers to self-certify that they meet these requirements. And then of course the DOT has audit rights. So if they catch wind that a particular training provider isn't actually qualified, then maybe they go in and do an audit and then they remove them from the list. But this is a self-certification process through the training provider registry. This is a similar process to what we see, for example, with the ELD, the electronic logging device list of certified devices. You know, if you're getting a new ELD, you have to go to the list and make sure that your ELD provider is on that self-certification list. That's just a self-certification list there too. Those ELD providers are certifying themselves that they meet all of the technical specifications. Same thing here, essentially. So here are the minimum standards that training providers, in order to be listed on the training provider registry, have to certify. Number one, they have to certify that their curriculum meets the minimum standards. These are the standards that I mentioned earlier that are listed in the appendix to the rules that set out the detailed curriculum that the training providers have to go through. Number two, you have to certify that if you are offering behind the wheel training, that your facilities and vehicles meet the criteria. And what criteria? Well, there's not a whole lot of criteria. The criteria for the vehicles is that you have to have available a vehicle of the same type that the driver that you're providing the training on. So if you're offering Class A training, you got to have a vehicle that meets the Class A criteria. Same with Class B, et cetera. Facilities, there's even less requirements with respect to those. They essentially say that if you're going to have range training, that you need to make sure that your lot for the range training is clear of obstacles and has good sight lines. That's essentially it. And then the instructors have to meet certain criteria. Do I have a separate slide here? No. Okay, so this is the big one, the instructors. In order to be an instructor that provides this training for a registered training provider, and the instructors have to meet certain minimum requirements. Namely, they have to currently hold a CDL of the same or higher class for which they're providing the training, or they have to have held one in the past, and the one in the past could not have been suspended, canceled, or downgraded for some safety-related violation. So in other words, if you have a retired driver who previously held a Class A CDL, doesn't currently have one, that person can provide the training. They can qualify as an instructor, even though they don't currently hold a CDL. But obviously that doesn't hold true for instructors who are actually going to be out on public roadways with drivers. If they're going to be out on public roadways, then they got to have a current CDL. But the important part there is that they got to have currently or have held the same or higher class for which they're providing the training. So you can't have an instructor who only held a Class B who's now given training on Class A. So that's the license requirement. And then the instructors also have to have at least 2 years worth of experience operating the same or higher class of vehicles for which they're providing the training. So those are the general requirements for instructors. The next thing you have to certify as a training provider is that you're going to comply with the record keeping rules. There are a number of record keeping rules that go into this. Training providers, as I mentioned, their primary obligation is, once they have a student who successfully completes their training, they have to upload a certificate of completion up to the training provider registry within 48 hours of the completion of that course. And so that's one of the things that you're certifying you will do if you're going to be listed on the training provider registry, is that you will meet that requirement and get that information uploaded quickly. And obviously that's important, because if you don't do that, then the driver is going to go to the license branch, and that document's not going to be in the registry yet for him or her to complete the transaction. So you certify that you're going to comply with the record keeping rules. And then lastly, you certify that you're going to meet any applicable state standards. This is the issue that I mentioned earlier, where if you're providing the training in a particular state, you've registered a particular location in Indiana, for example, then you are certifying that you meet any of Indiana's standards that they may have with respect to CDL training schools, essentially. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to be if you're going to offer training at a physical location, you need to check with your state, see if they have any specific requirements, and make sure that you meet those requirements before you get listed on the training provider registry. So I know that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions, because I know there's going to be quite a few questions, I think. So I will turn it back over to Marilyn here, and she can talk about how Tenstreet can help, and then we'll get into the questions.
Thank you, Brandon. That was insightful. It's a lot of information. So Tenstreet can help in a couple different ways. From a theory standpoint, we offer the required classes for entry-level driver training in all the different categories you see here, for Class A, for B to Class A upgrade, for Class B, for the hazmat endorsement, and then also the entry-level driver training passenger endorsement. We are only registered as a training provider for hazmat only instruction, meaning if you have drivers or students that you want to get certified and take the theory training in hazmat, we can provide that, and we can also report it on your behalf and be your training provider there. If you are a school or you are a carrier that's upgrading your own drivers or training your own students, we can provide theory training for you, but not any of the behind the wheel things like that. So if you have any questions about that, we're really excited about this. It's new for us, and so we don't have pricing yet, but we will be announcing a pricing update at the user conference at the end of April. So please email me at Marilyn Surber at Tenstreet.com or your advisor if you have any questions about how we can help you. And please also note, like if you're a current carrier using our training library, the training classes that are in the standard training library are configured just a little bit differently. The classes that are in the ELDT bundles were designed with those requirements in mind, meaning the grading requirements and all of those types of things. So in our standard training library, it's not configured that way. So I just want to avoid any confusion of people who might be assigning existing videos. So this is exciting stuff. Brandon, let's go through a few questions here, and
Yeah, let's do it.
why don't you tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing to help with this while I kind of make sense of which questions we're going to ask first.
Sure. Yeah, so we're in the process of developing our own theory-based training as well, similar to Tenstreet's. Ours is going to be a while before we offer it to the public. We're just taking our time building it out, making sure it's where we want it to be. We currently offer a bunch of different training courses, primarily for safety managers. So, safety directors, their management team, anybody who's in a position of managing regulated drivers. We have a bunch of pre-existing courses that run them through primarily their compliance obligations. So what they need to know about hours of service, what they need to know about driver qualification, DOT enforcement, CSA scores, that type of stuff. So that's where our focus has been primarily to this point. And so we've only just recently started to build out entry-level driver training that meets the requirements of the rule and is more geared towards drivers, whereas our focus has historically been on safety managers. So that's kind of what we're doing. We also, obviously, in our capacity as consultants and attorneys, we're helping motor carriers. We've helped a lot of motor carriers who are looking to kind of roll out their own training, providing for their own drivers. So we've had a lot of carriers come to us and ask for help, kind of looking into the state requirements that apply if they want to offer this in a particular state. So we do quite a bit of that as well.
Great, thank you, Brandon. Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming in, and so let's jump into that. The first one, is there an open range template anywhere that a company could use to set up their locations?
If there is, I'm not aware of it. I haven't seen any of those, but that sounds like a great idea to me. I just haven't seen one.
Yeah, me neither. So I'm glad we're on the same page. So is there a state listing of requirements that shows what exactly the difference is from states to federal? And
I wish.
Yeah.
Right. I wish. That would save me a lot of time and headache. No, there's not. And I've looked all over the place for that. I think, just my opinion, the entity that would be best suited to put something together like that would be the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, AAMVA. They do a lot of surveys like that for their states, where they look at what are the state CDL requirements. I don't believe that they've put something like that together. I think they should. I think that would be very helpful. But yeah, that does not exist, unfortunately.
Hopefully AMVA is working on that and it'll be coming. So
yeah.
Okay, so also we have drivers relocating from one state to another. These new states are not honoring the hazmat endorsement, and we'll have to get a new hazmat Do they need to go through this new theory training to get a new hazmat?
So this is
Like
a
a tough-
question that we don't have the answer to from FMCSA. I've been trying to get an answer to it. I haven't gotten it yet. So remember that I said that drivers who have held a CDL in the past uh, are grandfathered in. They don't have to get the new entry level driver training. They can go reinstate their CDL without going through the training. So my question is to FMCSA, is that true of endorsements as well? If I've held a hazmat endorsement in the past, but for whatever reason, if I let it lapse, or in this situation, if it seems strange to me that another state is not recognizing a hazmat endorsement. So you may check on that first to see why that's the case and see if that's lawful, first of all. But regardless, the question is, if they've held that hazmat endorsement in the past, do they have to go through the training? I think it should be the same way that we treat the drivers who have held the CDL in the past, that they shouldn't have to go through the entry level driver training again. But there's no FMCSA guidance on that point yet. So we're going to have to wait until we get a response from FMCSA on that. FMCSA does have an email address. I'd recommend they have one that's specific to entry level driver training. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but if you just go to their training provider registry website, if you just Google that, FMCSA training provider registry, they have a help email address. I would recommend you send an email to them and see if you can get a response on that quicker than I've been able to.
Another question, is there any change, or have you heard about any changes for getting doubles and triples endorsements?
No changes that I'm aware of. Obviously, those don't fall into this category of endorsements that require this particular type of entry level driver training. Now there is, and this is something we didn't really get into, but the regulations do, as whoever's asking this probably knows really well, there are specific training requirements still in existence that motor carriers have to provide to drivers of doubles and triple trailers. There's no changes to that process as far as I know, or that I've heard of being on the horizon.
Thank you. Okay, so what about someone who's wanting to drive a church bus that is going to be a Class C driver with the passenger endorsement? So I understand that person will only need to take the passenger theory training to be able to take the road test. Is that correct? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so Class C, obviously Class C is a vehicle that doesn't fit into the category of Class A or Class B. So here, church bus is classic example. You've got a vehicle that presumably holds more than 16 passengers, and so it requires a Class C CDL. The more specific question is, they need a passenger endorsement. So they only need to get take the training that's necessary for the passenger endorsement? That's my inclination. There's no FAQ as far as I'm aware from FMCSA on that point, but that would be how I would think it would work.
Another question is, my understanding from New Jersey is that they are not honoring grandfathered CDLs. Have you heard the same, and could the TSA help?
Yeah, so not the TSA. Don't ask them for help. You need to ask the FMCSA for help. I just got back from the MATS conference in Louisville, and I sat in a session with the FMCSA where their lead on this project on entry-level driver training spoke, and he addressed this issue where certain states are not fully understanding or appreciating the various exemptions to the rule. And his advice in that context was to send an email to that email address on their training provider registry, let them know what state it is, and then they will reach out to the state and clear up any of that type of confusion. So do that. Get on the training provider registry's website, find that generic entry-level driver training email address, shoot them an email, let them know New Jersey's causing you problems, and they're supposed to be reaching out to the state to address those issues.
Thank you. Okay, so if you have a training provider that's out of state, if they meet your state's guidelines, is that okay?
Yeah, so this was a lot easier to answer a couple of weeks ago. So a couple of weeks ago, there was guidance on the training providers Registry that talked about taking training in one state and then going to take your skills test in another state. Where, for example, I for whatever reason, I get my training in Illinois from an Illinois training provider that meets the Illinois requirements, and then I go and I'm actually licensed in Indiana, so I go over to Indiana and take the skills test. The guidance previously said that that was acceptable, that Indiana would have to recognize the validity of the training from Illinois. The reason I'm concerned that it's changed recently is because you may have seen this. The FMCSA has since, in the last week, withdrawn a prior rulemaking that it had in place where it was going to kind of give some more flexibility to the skills test process, where it was going to let drivers test in one state, even though they were licensed in another state, et cetera. I haven't looked yet to see if that has changed their stance on that topic in their guidance. That's something that I need to do, but I don't have the answer to it right now, unfortunately for you. I'm concerned that they would say no now, that if you have a driver who gets training in Illinois and it meets Illinois' training requirements, can that driver then go take the skills test in Indiana? I'm worried they would say no. But that's definitely something we need to nail down for sure.
And then I did have a note come in from John Fry, who was on the rulemaking committee for this, and it says it is worth noting that even if your state CDL test does not require all the backing maneuvers, you as a training provider must teach and certify all that are required in the curriculum.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the state can be more stringent on the rules, but if you're a training provider, you have to at least meet the federal. So whatever the curriculum is under the federal rules, you have to at least be teaching that. And then if your state has more stringent requirements and you're in that state providing the training, then you have to meet those requirements as well.
Thank you, John. And then when hiring CDL drivers, are employers required to verify completion of ELDT program certificate of completion? Is it required to be stored in the GQ file?
No, you're not. And so I get this question quite frequently. Yeah, you don't have any obligation to verify. The fact that they have their CDL is evidence that they've completed the training, assuming they just got the CDL, because you can't get your CDL, Class A or Class B nowadays, without having completed the training. If they didn't complete the training, then they wouldn't have the CDL, at least if the states are doing it correctly. So the fact that they present to you a valid CDL is evidence enough that they've completed the required training.
So that's really interesting. Have you heard from carriers at all, Brandon? Is that, you think that's going to be best practice, or do you think that carriers are going to still put that certificate in the DQ file? Or what would you advise someone to do?
So carriers have asked me that, and I don't think it's necessary. I don't see any reason why they should keep that, because the fact that they have the CDL is, in my view, saying the same thing as a certificate would. It's showing that they completed it, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to take the skills test to get the CDL in the first place. So clients who are asking me about it, I tell them I don't think it's necessary that they keep a copy of the certificate.
Okay. As a former processor, that kind of made me twitch just a little bit. So I appreciate that. Okay, so you have a driver that goes through a mom and pop CDL school. This is where it's their responsibility to make sure the school is ELDT certified.
Yeah, they need to make sure that provider is on the training provider registry. If you go to the training provider registry, I think it's tpr.fmcsa.dot.gov. That's the website. They have a search function where you search out for a registered training provider. My advice to anybody that's looking to get training is that you make that your first stop and make sure that the training provider you're going to is actually listed. Because if you go to mom and pops and it turns out that they weren't actually registered on the training provider registry, and then you just spend all that money and all that time taking their training, and then you go to your state licensing agency, then that training is not going to be recognized, and you're going to have to go get compliant training. So yeah, you need to make sure that they're on the training provider registry.
Where can we find a checklist for trainers to keep track of ELDT requirements of theory, BTW, in BTW public roadways?
Yeah, go to the TPR website, again, tpr.fmcsa.dot.gov. They have a lot of good printouts like that, one-page printouts that talk about all the different requirements for different categories of folks, including the instructors and stuff like that.
So another question, even though ELDT has no hourly requirements, do you think most large carriers will still require a specific number of program hours in a training program? For example, 150 to 160?
They may, and it may be because they're domiciled in a state that has a minimum hours requirement, right? So if carrier ABC Transportation is offering training to their employee drivers, and they've got locations throughout the country, and they want to offer training at those various locations, they're going to have to be researching the states in which they have those training locations. And if a particular state says you got to have 150 hours or whatever it is, then that particular location is going to have to meet those requirements in order for that training provider to continue to be listed on the training provider registry. So for that reason, you're going to see carriers that have minimum hours, and then maybe they just say, well, we're not going to mess with trying to figure this out on a state by state basis. We're going to pick the state that has the most stringent ones, and we're just going to roll that across all of our locations. And so maybe for that reason, you'll see carriers adhere to a specific number of hours.
Well, that's a great point. Another question came in that said, is this over and above a truck driving school, or would this be included?
Yeah, so Marilyn, you and I were talking about this. So we were wondering, curious how existing truck driving schools were doing this. Obviously, the well-known ones are on top of this. My concern is that the less well-known ones are not so on top of this. And so what you're going to end up with are drivers who are misled into thinking that if they complete that truck driving school, that they're going to be ready to go to get their CDL, but that's not the case. This is a requirement that they have to meet regardless of whether they went to a truck driving school. So suffice it to say, truck driving schools really need to, if they're going to continue offering their services that they're great at providing, they really need to have a plan in place for their students to be able to get this training while they're at the truck driving school. They essentially need to register themselves as a training provider and make sure that they meet all the curriculum requirements so that the student isn't essentially having to go through two separate training programs. They just go through the one, and then they would be eligible to then complete their CDL transaction. But again, that's why it's important for drivers to check and make sure that wherever they're going is actually a registered training provider, and that the program that they're completing is going to satisfy these requirements.
Thank you. So we have a question came in that does Tenstreet offer a course for obtaining the CLP for Class A? Not today, but we can add that to see what we can do to add that to our list. Do you know anything? Do you guys have that, Brandon?
We don't know. No.
Okay, I think we've answered all the questions. If we don't have any more, Brandon, why don't you tell everybody how we can get in touch with you if we needed to?
Yeah, trucksafeconsulting.com is our website. You'll find a bunch of educational content there. We have detailed articles on all kinds of regulatory topics. If you're interested in that type of thing, we've got a bunch of videos on our YouTube channel, and we do a live show every month where we talk about DOT regs. We bring guests on from throughout the industry to talk about these issues. So check us out there. You can reach me directly at brandon@trucksafeconsulting.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And yes, Justin, we're going to have to wait till the user conference in April for the pricing. I'm sorry. Jessica Hughes, who is on this call, will kill me if I try to say any pricing on this webinar. So either way, thank you guys for your time today. You're going to get 10 minutes of your afternoon back. We really appreciate it. And please reach out to Brandon or I if you have any questions, or your advisor if you have any questions about how Tenstreet can help. And thank you guys for spending the afternoon with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.